I've always been interested in playing the old school Resident Evil games. Around the age of 8 to 9, I had tried my hardest to get through Resident Evil 2. I mostly forced my way through the puzzles, then I got stuck so hard I never completed the game. Not much longer after, I would try and play games like Code Veronica X and Outbreak, but the puzzles still prevented me from completing them. Fast forward to 2005, Resident Evil was released. I was floored playing the game at the time. No other game had been doing the things RE4 was doing. It blew my 11-year-old mind. For better or worse, Resident Evil 4 changed the video game industry. Recently, though, I couldn't help but feel that I didn't give the classic tank control games a fair shot. With the port of the GameCube remake to the newer consoles, I finally decided to play Resident Evil. Resident Evil is one of the most well-thought-out games I've ever seen. Shinji Mikami put a lot of effort into making the game as scary as possible. After the initial cutscene, you're free to explore the mansion as you please. The only thing you're given is a general direction and a gun. Because the mansion is very maze-like in its design, exploring it is an incredibly daunting task. Coupled with enemies and tank controls, each new unexplored room becomes a stressful ordeal. As you progress through the game, you'll start to notice common enemy placements. The game would become incredibly easy if you could just memorize enemy placements. The designers accounted for this with the introduction of tougher enemies such as the Crimson Heads and Hunters. More on them later. Because you're often going to areas multiple times, the tank controls become easier. The tank controls have always been a point of contention in Resident Evil. They're often criticized for being clunky. For those who don't know, let me break it down. With the tank controls, the player rotates the character model by pushing left or right on the stick or D-pad, down to move backwards and up to move forward. The movement system never changes depending on the camera angle. To me, this is a deliberate design choice. The tank controls creates tension in enemy encounters by limiting the player's movement. In any other game, the movement system would be incredibly clunky, but it's honestly the ideal control scheme given the camera system. In this port, the developers added the option for a more traditional movement system. When the option is turned on, it allows the player to move freely amongst the 2D space relative to the camera angle. With the classic control, if confronted with an enemy, the player would need to slowly back up and do a quick 180-degree turn. This takes a considerable amount of time and space. With the traditional control scheme turned on, the player can instantly turn around to run away without any regard for their distance or space. This instantly destroys the stress of many enemy encounters. Enemies become a joke to deal with. Trivializing them like this destroys any tension from enemy encounters. This isn't the only problem with the modern control scheme. The modern analog movement clashes with the camera. When the camera changes, it's natural for the player to adjust the control stick depending on the camera angle. This often causes the player to awkwardly transition between two angles multiple times, and causes the character model to quickly correct to the correct direction. This is incredibly jarring. I understand the need to have this option, but it isn't worth hampering the game design. In my opinion, the classic tank controls are a must. Not only does it add some depth to the gameplay, the game would be less unique as well. It's a shame that most people will play with the new controls for an easier game and miss out on the definitive experience of Resident Evil. Making choices is a core aspect of Resident Evil's design. Each choice itself and its consequences all each add a unique layer of tension. The very first thing the player decides is whether to play as Chris or Jill. The game doesn't spell out the differences between the two characters, it promotes multiple playthroughs. Chris is better at combat, moves faster, has 6 inventory slots, and a permanent lighter on hand. Jill, on the other hand, has 8 inventory slots, moves slower, is worse at combat, and has a lockpick on hand. Resident Evil rewards smart gameplay choices. Resources such as ammo, healing items, and ink ribbons are scarce. All the items have the potential to be wasted or used efficiently. For example, a single green herb could be used to heal a small amount of health, or it can be mixed with red herbs to fully heal you. This can apply to ammo and ink ribbons as well. I always prefer to save most of my stronger ammo for bosses and other unique encounters. Other players may choose to eliminate all the common enemies with the downside of having much less ammo for bosses. Since the game only gives you a set amount of resources, it's entirely possible to ruin your playthrough. Having your playthrough ruined is obviously very upsetting for the player, but in the right context I feel like it can strengthen a game. This ultimately depends on the length of the game. Resident Evil is incredibly short, so even if the playthrough becomes unfinishable, there isn't much time lost. As I mentioned before, Crimson Heads start appearing to subvert players' expectations. Defeated zombies left on the floor eventually become the much deadlier enemies called Crimson Heads. Crimson Heads move incredibly fast and have a much more health than regular zombies. This can be prevented by burning regular zombies' bodies. Burning the bodies uses the resource kerosene. Kerosene is available in limited amounts on set location containers all around the map. Each zombie creates a multitude of options for the player. This creates a risk-reward scenario for the player. Should the player take the time and resources to travel to the nearest container? Or should they kill it and take the risk of having a Crimson Head appear later? Or should they completely avoid the zombie altogether? This decision mostly depends on how skilled the player it is. Skilled players could probably get through the game without killing many zombies, while during my first playthrough I made sure to burn as many bodies as possible. Inventory management plays a huge factor in the game. At any given moment, the player needs at least 3 to 4 inventory slots dedicated to a weapon, ammo, and a key, and maybe a healing item. This only leaves 3 to 4 inventory slots depending on the character. You're in constant debate on how much ammo versus healing items you need to carry at any given point. More ammo lets you defeat monsters easier, but healing items can help if you make mistakes. In addition, the player needs to allow spaces for future items, including puzzles. Playing it safe and keeping your inventory stocked full of items ends up actually being more of a hassle in the long run. Players won't be able to pick up the puzzle items they need and eventually ends up with more backtracking to the item box. Since the player can't just carry all the ammo and healing items they need, it's a unique way to force the player to take the risks they normally wouldn't take. The pacing is excellent. After every gameplay segment, the player is presented with either a new enemy type, boss fight, a new area, or a scripted event. First example of this is after an hour or so of playing, the game introduces the Crimson Heads. Eventually you'll explore outside the mansion. Compared to the mansion, the outside areas are actually pretty straightforward. Ideally, I would have preferred an additional smaller maze-like area like the mansion, but I'm still very pleased with the overall level design of the game. Even though the areas introduced later are very linear, it's refreshing to see new area designs. One of the bonuses of this port is the newly done graphics. All the character models have been redone, and even some environments have been re-rendered. For each area redone, there's maybe 1 or 2 areas that haven't been restored faithfully. The original game had some artifacting due to the compression, but upscaling them to higher resolutions only accentuates them. It's jarring when going from one redone area to another untouched area. The flickering in Lisa's cabin looks incredibly out of place. The new lighting system makes the whole area crawl. It's disappointing to see such an excellent game get a botched port. Despite my complaints with the new port, I still really recommend this game to anyone with the slightest interest. Even if you're apprehensive about tank controls, I really suggest you try and overcome them and play the game. Resident Evil is one of the most well thought out games I've ever seen. It's clear that Shinji Mikami put a lot of effort into making the game as scary as possible. Everything from static camera angles to the level design deliberately creates a stressful situation for the player. The way each of them synergizes makes it a beautifully executed game. This game is almost 13 years old at this point, and yet still holds up completely to this day. Even though it's one of the earliest survival horror games, Resident Evil still holds up. Remake proves that excellent game design stands the test of time. Had the developers decided to go through another route, I don't think I would still be talking about this game today. The game is a beautifully crafted masterpiece.